He was the man who had written this world, every empire on its maps, every scar on its heroes. The blood spilled in its darkest chapter had been typed with his own two hands. And now, 3 days from that chapter, he was the one whose blood was scheduled to spill. Nobody in this world knew the truth. To the noble families sharpening their swords, he was only a half-demon villain waiting to die. To the demon lords across the border, he was only a mixed-blood traitor. To the young princess who would soon meet him, he was only a stranger with silver hair and cold fox eyes. But he was more than that. He was the god of the plot, and right now, that god was terrified. This is the story of a novelist who woke up inside his own book, in the body of the villain he himself had killed off in the final chapter, with only a slip of enchanted paper standing between him and the death he had already written. 3 nights earlier, in another world entirely, a tired young writer named Nam Woo-hyun had fallen asleep at his desk. The story on his screen was almost finished. It was a long, cruel novel about 7 demon clans, an academy of monsters, and a mixed-blood villain called Arsenadell who dies alone in a burning manor. Nam Woo-hyun had typed the last line of that death scene. Then he closed his eyes. When they opened again, they were not his own eyes. He was lying on silk sheets in a cold stone bedroom. His hands were small and pale. His hair was long and silver. In a tall mirror across the room, a boy with sharp fox eyes stared back at him, and Nam Woo-hyun almost stopped breathing. He knew that face. He had drawn it once, on the back of a napkin, on a slow Sunday 2 years ago. It was Arsenadell. For a long, silent moment, he thought he had lost his mind. He touched the mirror. The boy in it touched back. He whispered his own name. The boy's mouth moved with his. He said Arsenadell's name. The boy's mouth still moved with his. Slowly, panic climbing his ribs, he began to search the room. There was a heavy sword rack, a blood-stained rug, and a locked door. There were old scars on the boy's arms, thin and pale, from a childhood Nam Woo-hyun had once summarized in 2 quick paragraphs. On the pillow beside him lay a folded slip of yellow paper, glowing faintly. The paper trembled in his hand when he unfolded it. Words bled onto its surface in slow, elegant script. The words were not his. They belonged to someone else in this room. Someone who was still here, watching. The script asked who was inside its body. Nam Woo-hyun almost dropped the note. His mouth was dry. His stolen heart beat much too fast. Then, hands shaking, he found a pen on the bedside table and wrote back. He explained, in short, stunned lines, that he was a writer from another world. That he had gone to sleep and woken up here. That he had, somehow, dreamed this world into being. The reply came slowly, and it was cold. The original Arsenadell's soul was still inside this body. He had lived his whole locked life in this stone bedroom, kept away as the shameful mixed-blood son of a hated noble house. And he was very, very angry at the strange presence sharing his skull. But he was also useful. On the yellow paper, the two of them made a bargain. Answers for a price. The original Adele knew every trait sleeping in this body's blood. He knew the walls of this manor and the traps of this county. He would tell what he knew, but every answer would cost something. Gold, mana, sometimes objects of value. The soul on the other end of the paper was not a friend. He was a merchant with a grudge. Still, in this quiet room, the writer in the stolen body felt something loosen in his chest. He was not alone in his own head. Then he asked the first real question. What day was it? The paper answered, and the answer was worse than he had feared. It was the day Captain Feltz and a squad of trained killers were scheduled to break down his door and gut him in his own bed. Downstairs, boots were already on the marble floor. He could hear them, 6 sets, moving with the quiet weight of professionals. From the shadows of the hallway, servants were being dragged from their posts. Someone was choking. Someone else was praying. In 3 minutes, at most, that door would come apart. Nam Woo-hyun sat on the edge of the bed and forced himself to think like the writer he was. He had built this scene. He had written it as a tragedy. But every tragedy hid a solution somewhere, buried in the same pages the author had already put down. He looked around the bedroom with new eyes. Sword rack, heavy chandelier above his head, tall window with brittle glass. A rug his own blood was meant to soak into. His fingers found the paper again. He wrote fast, in scrawled letters. What traits did this body have? The answer bled through slowly, and it came at a price. The original Adele demanded the small silver ring on his finger, an heirloom the villain had worn since he was 6. Nam Woo-hyun hesitated. Then he pushed the ring against the paper. The metal dissolved into gold dust and vanished. In its place, 3 words appeared. Position transfer, darkness, killing intent. Nam Woo-hyun almost laughed. He remembered writing them. He remembered typing the entire skill tree out on a lazy afternoon, calling it clever. He had not realized, back then, that clever people also died in stone bedrooms. Boots reached the top of the stairs. He closed his eyes and reached inside himself. There was a strange, cool current running under his skin. He had never touched mana before in his life, but the paper had given him the shape of it, and the original Adele's blood remembered. He gripped that current the way a drowning man grips a rope. The door exploded inward. 6 knights stepped through. Their armor was the crimson and gold of Leon County. Their leader, a broad man with a thick neck and small bored eyes, was Captain Feltz. Nam Woo-hyun had written this man in a single afternoon. He had given him 3 lines of dialogue and a small, cruel smile. Feltz wore that smile now. The captain walked forward as if the boy on the bed were furniture. His sword was already out. It was long and dark and hummed with a cheap enchantment the writer had described in 1 line and forgotten. Feltz said, calmly, that Lion County was tired of half-demon vermin. He said it was time for the vermin to be swept away. Nam Woo-hyun let him talk. Behind his back, his fingers were already tracing lines on the yellow paper. He whispered a single question. He offered Feltz's own blade as payment. The paper glowed. Then, in one breath, several things happened at once. The sword in Feltz's hand crumbled. It did not shatter. It did not break. It came apart from tip to hilt in a soft cloud of gold dust and rained gently onto the rug. Feltz stared down at his empty fist, mouth open. Behind him, a knight lunged forward with a spear to finish the job. Nam Woo-hyun lifted one hand toward the weapon. The world twitched. Suddenly, the boy on the bed was standing behind the knight, and the knight was falling forward onto the empty sheets, and the spear was still in the air where its owner had thrown it. It stabbed down through nothing. Nam Woo-hyun drove the man's own dagger into the back of his neck. Blood soaked the pillow. He almost threw up. He had never killed anyone. He had only ever written the killings. The other knights turned too slow. Feltz screamed something about seizing the boy alive. Nam Woo-hyun did not wait. He ran 3 steps, threw himself at the tall window, and crashed through it. The glass tore his sleeves. Broken pieces caught his cheek. He hit the garden below in a heap, rolled once, and was up and running before the shards had finished falling. At the edge of the estate wall, he stopped, turned, and looked back. The captain was framed in the shattered window, still staring at his empty sword hand. He looked, in that instant, like a man who no longer understood the story he was in. The writer in the stolen body smiled with a mouth that was not his own. Then he vanished into the dark. For 2 full nights, the boy in the stolen body ran east. He slept in barns. He stole cold bread from a farmer's window ledge and left 3 copper coins on the sill, out of some old habit from a life without a stolen face. He kept his hood pulled low and his fox eyes down. In every town he passed, wanted posters had already gone up. The bounty on Arsenadell's head was climbing hour by hour. The paper stayed close against his chest. He used it as little as he could afford. Every answer cost something. Every scrap of the original Adele's knowledge cost gold or memory or trinkets, and Nam Woo-hyun had almost nothing left. So he asked only the questions that mattered. Where was the gate to the demon realm? Which road would be watched? Which forest would swallow him if he took the wrong turn? The soul on the other end of the paper answered with the bored patience of an angry god. At the border of Leon County, in a bruise-colored valley the humans called the Split Woods, there was a hidden gate. It was old and almost forgotten. Only a handful of half-demons still knew how to slip through it. The gate was guarded by a domain, a small enchanted trial designed by ancient sorcerers, and inside that domain waited a treasure the original Adele had craved his entire caged life, the Eye of Superbia. Nam Woo-hyun remembered writing that thing. He had dropped it into the domain as a footnote, a throwaway detail to explain why a certain enemy in a later arc could dodge arrows. He had not expected, when he typed it, to walk inside his own footnote wearing his own villain's skin. The Split Woods swallowed him at dawn. From the outside, the domain looked like a plain wall of gray stone hiding in the roots of an ancient tree. Inside, it opened into a long stone corridor, lit by pale blue fire. Statues stood along the walls. They watched him move. He kept one hand on the paper. The original Adele explained the trial in short, mocking lines. The statues came alive when a trespasser stopped moving. The corridor rearranged itself when a trespasser looked away. And somewhere in the last chamber, a shadow with a single glowing eye waited to weigh the applicant's soul. Na Mu-hyun did not stop moving. He walked through the first corridor at an even pace. When two statues stepped down from their pedestals and lifted stone axes toward him, he did not fight. Instead, he tapped the paper, whispered the words the soul had given him, and swapped places with a small pebble on the floor 30 feet behind them. The axes came down on empty air. He kept walking. The domain groaned, confused. It threw a pit at his feet. He swapped places with a candle across the pit. A wall of spinning blades slid out of the ceiling. He swapped places with a torch on the other side. In every trap, he made himself the coin, and the coin never stayed where the trap was set to catch it. He was learning the shape of his own trick. Position transfer had a limit, the paper warned. 20 yards, at first, and every use bit at his mana like a hungry small dog. But the boy in the stolen body was a writer, and a writer's first instinct was to look at a rule and find its loophole. By the time he reached the last chamber, he was almost giddy. The shadow waited there, tall and thin, with a single burning eye set into its face. It said nothing. It did not need to. The eye was the trial itself. It looked at him, and it saw the truth. It saw a frightened young man from another world, wearing a stolen body, holding a paper he had not earned, and it hesitated. For a moment, Na Mu-hyun thought it might reject him. Then the shadow spoke in a voice that felt like cold water down his spine. It said the eye had been waiting a long time. It said it had been waiting for someone who could truly see. It said, with something almost like relief, that a writer's eye was a good enough eye. The single glowing pupil detached itself from the shadow's face. It floated across the chamber, slid into Na Mu-hyun's own eye socket, and settled there like it had always been his. He staggered under the sudden weight of the world. Every mote of dust in the air had an edge to it now. Every twitch of every muscle in a distant enemy became a book he could read at a glance. The eye of Superbia was his. The shadow was already dissolving. The domain was already unlocking. Somewhere on the far side of the corridor, a door was opening onto the demon realm, and its dark air was pouring in like smoke. He almost cried with relief. He did not know a young woman was already standing in the doorway, watching him. She was tall. She was pale. She was carrying a sword bigger than she was, and she was carrying it like it weighed nothing. Her hair was moonlight white, cropped short, and her eyes were the flat cold of a frozen lake. She wore the black cloak and silver stitching of the Bear Clan of Pride. She could not have been older than 17. She could not have been kinder than a winter blade. She stared at the boy who had just swallowed the eye of Superbia. He stared back at her. Na Mu-hyun knew who she was before she spoke. He had written her. Her name was Renee. She was the daughter of the Bear Clan's patriarch. She was one of the most gifted young swordswomen in the demon realm, and she was here in this domain because her father had sent her to retrieve that same eye. He had just stolen it, in front of her, out from under her nose. For a long, awful second, he considered running. Then he considered lying. Then he considered dying quickly to avoid the humiliation. In the end, the writer in him did what writers always do. He made up a better story. He bowed to her, slow and correct, the way an heir bowed to a princess. He said, in the calm voice of a servant reporting for duty, that he had been sent ahead by her father to secure the eye and hand it over the moment she arrived. He apologized for not identifying himself sooner. He said the patriarch had asked for discretion. Every word of that was a lie. Renee did not believe him. He could see that plainly. Her hand tightened on her sword. Her cold eyes searched his face for the giveaway. She asked, in a low voice, why a stranger with fox eyes and a filthy human cloak had been chosen for such a delicate errand. Na Mu-hyun smiled and answered with something the original Adele had once whispered on the paper. He said the eye chose its own bearer, and it had chosen him for a reason. He said her father had already known that would happen and had planned around it. She almost drew. Then, because he needed her to hesitate and he needed it now, he did something that surprised even himself. He glanced at her sword, tapped the paper against his sleeve, and swapped places with the blade. In a blink, he was standing where the sword had been, and the sword was standing where he had been, its tip lightly resting against Renee's own throat. She froze. She did not flinch. She did not scream. She only stared at him over the length of her own weapon. Nobody in her cold, disciplined life had ever bested her without lifting a hand. And whatever else Renee was, she was a warrior. She respected that. Nam Woo-hyun let the blade fall away. He gave her a small, careful bow. He said he meant her no harm. He said her father was expecting them both. He said quietly that if she wanted to test him again, she was welcome to do it in the training yard, where nobody could die by accident. Renee looked at him for a long time. Then she picked up her sword and slid it back across her shoulder. She did not smile. She did not thank him. She only said in her flat, precise voice that he would walk in front of her from now on, and if he tried anything, she would take his head. She turned and walked out of the domain into the demon realm. He followed her, heart pounding, into the dark. The Bear Clan estate lay 3 days' ride to the east. They took that ride in near silence. Renee did not trust him. She spent the first day watching him from the corner of her eye, waiting for him to bolt. On the second day, she stopped watching. On the third day, she rode beside him rather than behind him, though she still did not speak. He wondered, without saying so, if that was as close to friendship as Renee gave. The estate was a cold, black-stoned mountain of a place, ringed with iron and heavy with the smell of old smoke. Patriarch Kree of the Bear Clan met them in the entrance hall. He was enormous. He was as tall as 2 men and as wide as 3, with a thick gray beard and a stare that felt like walking into a wall. He wore a plain black robe. He carried no weapon. He did not need one. Renee bowed to him and reported. She said the eye had already been taken, and by this stranger. Kree looked at the stranger. For a long moment he said nothing. The whole hall said nothing. The servants along the walls did not breathe. Somewhere in a distant corridor, a small dog started barking and was quickly silenced. Nam Woo-hyun felt every hair on his arms lift. Then the patriarch smiled. It was not a kind smile. It was the smile of a man who had already decided how to solve his problem. Kree came down the steps of the hall in 3 heavy strides. He put a hand on the boy's shoulder. That hand was warm and terrible. He said he was pleased that a young man with such talent had wandered into his door. He said he would love to welcome him into the clan. He said, casually, that the terms of that welcome were very simple. Then he pinned Nam Woo-hyun to the floor with one hand. The boy did not have time to scream. He did not have time to reach for the paper. The stone slammed into his back. His breath left him. Kree crouched over him with all the gentle patience of a butcher preparing a lamb, and from a small silver box tucked in his robe, he produced something that squirmed. It was a worm. A dark, wet, glistening worm the size of a finger, ringed with tiny hooked mouths. Nam Woo-hyun had written it once as a footnote for a torture scene he had later cut. The thing was called a loyalty worm. It settled inside the throat of its host. It fed on their mana. And, at a single word from its master, it would tear out their heart from the inside. Kree lowered it toward the boy's mouth. Nam Woo-hyun shook his head. He tried to speak. He tried to bargain. He tried to promise anything at all. Kree only pressed one thick thumb against his jaw, forced his teeth apart, and dropped the worm inside. The pain was beyond words. The worm slid down his throat like a burning stone. It bit at the walls of his gullet. It nested somewhere deep inside his chest and hooked itself into a place that felt more like soul than flesh. Nam Woo-hyun writhed on the polished floor. Renee looked away, hands tight at her sides. She did not disagree with her father. She simply did not wish to watch. The patriarch stood up and dusted off his hands. He said, gently, that the boy was now a member of the household. He said the worm would keep him honest. He said that in return, the boy would attend Saitan Academy at Renee's side as her bodyguard and shield, and if he served well, the worm might one day be removed. He said all of this as if it were a gift. Nam Woo-hyun lay on the black stone, tasting blood, staring up at the vaulted ceiling, and thought, quietly, that he had lived through worse endings in the pages of his own book. He also thought, quietly, that Patriarch Kree had made a mistake. Because the boy on the floor had a paper in his pocket and a trick nobody else knew. He closed one hand around it. He whispered a single question. He offered a small silver coin from his sleeve. On the yellow surface, the original Adele's answer bled through in 3 cold words. Swap the worm. Nam Woo-hyun smiled with a mouth full of blood. Very slowly, so slowly nobody in the hall noticed, he reached inside himself the way he had reached for mana in his bedroom 3 nights ago. He found the worm coiled around his heart. He touched it with his mind. He picked, as its exchange, a small dead beetle sitting in a crack of the black stone floor beside his hand. Then he swapped them. The worm popped out of his mouth, alive and confused, and dropped onto the ground. Nobody saw it happen. Nobody was watching a beetle. The boy on the floor coughed once, softly, and let his head fall back as if the pain had finally taken him. Inside his chest, where the worm had been, there was now only a small, harmless insect. Nam Wu-hyun closed his eyes and hid his smile against the cold stone. He was still a captive. He was still bound to a monster. He was still headed to an academy full of teenagers who wanted him dead. But he was, at last, one step ahead of the story. Somewhere above him, Patriarch Kree was already asking Renee where the boy's rooms should be prepared, and how soon the clan's ancient cultivation technique should be taught to him, so that his mana would grow strong enough to serve his young mistress in the coming war. The young man on the floor listened. Behind his closed eyelids, the writer in him began to plan. Tomorrow at dawn, in the Bear Clan's oldest ritual chamber, an old prayer would be spoken over him, and a god would look down. He woke before dawn. Somewhere in the black stone corridors of the Bear Clan estate, a bell had been ringing for a full minute before he opened his eyes. 2 silent servants stood at the foot of his bed. They had brought a plain black robe and a bowl of cold water. They did not speak. They did not look at him. They simply waited. He rose without a word. He washed. He put the robe on. He tucked the yellow paper against his skin, under the fabric, where nobody would think to search. Then he followed the servants down through the estate, past dark halls and quiet altars, until the mountain itself seemed to swallow the walls around him, and open into a wide circular chamber cut from raw obsidian. Patriarch Kree was already there. The old bear of a man stood at the center of the chamber, arms folded, watching him come. Torches burned along the walls in a slow blue color. In the middle of the black floor, a great circle had been carved into the stone. Its lines glowed faintly. Its edges were older than the estate above. Kree pointed to the center of the circle. He said, in his low voice, that a member of the Bear Clan trained his mana on the first morning of every month for the first year of his service. He said the ritual he was about to teach was old, and that not everybody could survive it. He said, with a small smile, that a strong body was welcomed by the god above, and a weak body was politely eaten. Nam Wu-hyun felt his stolen skin turn cold. He stepped into the circle anyway. There was no other door out of this chamber. Behind him, Renee stood in the shadows of a pillar, arms crossed, watching without expression. He wondered if she had watched other young men fail this same test. He wondered if she had watched them get eaten. Kree walked around the circle in slow steps and began to speak the old words. The stone under the boy's feet lit up in slow rings, one after another, blue, then silver, then a strange gray that no color chart in the writer's head had a name for. His head grew heavy. His chest grew tight. The chamber above him seemed to hollow out, as if the ceiling had been quietly removed and replaced with a much bigger, much older sky. Then something enormous looked down. He did not see a face. He saw an idea of a face. He saw a shape big enough to fold a mountain in half, wearing a crown of horns that rolled across a night full of dead stars. He felt his own smallness in a way he had never felt in his own world. He was a bug in a cup, and the cup was being lifted toward a mouth. The demon god of pride considered him. The god's attention was not kind. It did not want to speak with him. It touched his soul the way a bored merchant might turn a coin between 2 fingers, testing its weight, checking its edges. It found the mixed blood in his veins. It found the human writer curled up inside the villain's shape. It found, deeper still, a small piece of something the god had not expected to find in a body this weak. The chamber shook. Very faintly, the god spoke. Its voice did not use sound. It used the inside of his skull. It called him the blood of a traitor. It said his line had bowed to humans in a war long past. It said his death had been overdue for 100 years. Nam Wu-hyun closed his eyes and waited to die. But the god did not kill him. Instead, the great weight above pressed down onto his chest, and where it pressed, a mark burned. A small silver eye opened on his heart in a slow, careful pattern. The god called it an insignia. It said the mark was given not out of love but out of curiosity. It said the traitor's blood would be allowed to grow, so that pride could see what a traitor did with a gift. Then it went away. The blue rings on the floor dimmed. The chamber came back to its normal shape. Nam Woo-hyun swayed on his feet, then dropped to one knee and vomited a thin stream of gold light across the stone. His hands shook, his heart pounded like a hammer. His mana pool, which had been the modest well of a barely trained boy, had cracked open into a lake. Kree, watching, laughed once. The patriarch said the god had been generous. He said generosity from pride was rarely without a price. He said the boy would grow, or he would be crushed under the weight of what he had just been given. He turned and walked out of the chamber without waiting for a reply. Renee stayed a moment longer. She looked at the boy on the floor. She did not smile. She did not offer a hand, but she said, quietly, that he had done well. Then she left him alone in the circle, gold light still dripping between his fingers. He rested for 2 days. By the 3rd day, the silver eye on his chest had stopped burning. His hands had stopped shaking. He had learned to feel the size of his new mana pool, and it terrified him. He was still weak. He was still slow. But the well he could draw from now was the well of an heir, not a servant. He needed to grow, and he needed to grow fast. The paper had already given him an idea. Not far from the Bear Clan estate, buried under the roots of an old dead forest, there was a domain the demon nobles called the Silent Grave. The original Adele had marked it on the paper as a place worth breaking into. A necromancer had built it as a private laboratory long ago, and inside it slept an artifact the writer's earlier chapters had described as a small black dagger with a mouth for a hilt, the Fang of Darkness. It was the second key the writer needed. His darkness trait was a thin trick without a proper weapon to focus it. With the Fang, his shadows would grow teeth. He convinced Renee to come with him. He did not tell her the truth. He told her, in the calm tone of a bored bodyguard, that her father wanted him tested against a lesser dungeon before Saitan Academy. He said her presence would ensure the test was fair. She looked at him for a long moment, weighing his words, and then agreed. Renee did not enjoy lying. She did enjoy the smell of a good fight. They rode out at dusk. The Silent Grave lay under a dry riverbed, half a night's ride from the estate. Its entrance was a plain black stone set among broken trees. Only a small rune on its face marked it as anything more than a rock. Nam Woo-hyun pressed the rune the way the paper had shown him. The stone folded inward. A stair of pale bone dropped down into the dark. Renee went first, sword drawn, without a word. He followed her. Inside, the domain was much larger than it looked. It ran through the ribs of the earth in wide, cold corridors, lit by no fire. The only light came from thin veins of green fungus glowing in the walls. The air smelled of old blood and older parchment. Somewhere far below, a soft, wet sound repeated itself in an even rhythm, as if a heart still beat under all that stone. Undead things came at them almost at once. Skeletons, pale and quick, slid out of the walls in 2s and 3s. Bone-armored ghouls climbed down the ceiling. Renee took the first wave apart, with 3 clean cuts of her sword, each strike quiet, each one final. She fought like a metronome. She did not shout. She did not gloat. She simply worked. Nam Woo-hyun worked beside her. He fought differently than she did. He was not strong enough to trade blows with a ghoul, so he did not trade. He swapped places with pebbles, with fallen bones, with distant torches, and he showed up on their flanks, on their backs, above their heads. He struck once with the small stolen dagger from his belt and moved. He struck again from a different angle and moved. In every scuffle, he was the last person the ghoul expected, and the first person to bleed it. Renee watched him work. She did not say what she thought. Her cold eyes only followed him from one swap to the next, quietly filing away the pattern. He suspected she was already learning how to fight him, in case she ever had to. He tried not to think about that. They pushed deeper. In the 4th chamber, they found a wide circular pit ringed with old lanterns. At the pit's center, on a raised black altar, floated a small pale orb the size of a fist. Around the altar, 3 tall figures in tattered robes drifted in slow, patient circles. Their faces were empty of eyes. The paper had warned him about these. They were the domain's necromancer wardens, and the orb between them was the heart of the whole place. Break the orb, and the wardens fell. Fail to break it, and the wardens simply killed you again and again until you stopped moving. Renee moved toward the pit. He touched her sleeve. He said quietly that this one was his. She looked at him. She did not understand, but she stepped back. Nam Woo-hyun crouched at the edge of the pit and slid the yellow paper out of his sleeve. He wrote one short question on it and offered, as its price, one of the pale silver coins he had taken from Feltz's dead knight. The paper burned bright. Its answer came in a single line. Trade the orb for a stone. He almost laughed at the simplicity. He picked a small chip of broken bone from the floor. He held it in his palm. He looked at the pale orb hovering above the altar between the three drifting wardens. He whispered the words for position transfer with exchange, a variant the original Adele had marked as costly, and he pushed his new insignia-boosted mana into the swap. The orb vanished from the altar. The bone chip appeared in its place. The wardens did not notice. The orb was in his hand, warm and quiet, before Renee understood what had happened. He held it up so she could see. Then, calmly, he crushed it against the stone floor. The three wardens collapsed at once. Their robes fell empty into the pit. Somewhere far below, that slow, wet heartbeat stuttered and stopped. The green fungus in the walls guttered out. The domain was theirs. They found the necromancer's chamber at the deepest end of the corridors. A small black dagger lay on a plain iron stand. Its blade was thin, curved, and carved with a single open mouth along its edge. Nam Wuhyun lifted it with careful fingers. The moment he touched it, his own shadow crawled a step closer to him, as if greeting an old friend. The fang of darkness was his. Beside the dagger, on a smaller stand, sat a plain silver ring. It was set with a single pale gem shaped like a full moon. The paper on his chest hummed softly against his skin, warm and pleased. He read its short note without paying much attention. It only said the ring had once belonged to an ancient priestess, and that it was a good enough reward for a first dungeon. He almost left it there. Then he thought of Renee. She had guarded him without complaint. She had walked into a dead man's tomb because he asked her to. He remembered, with a small ache, that in the novel he had written, this same girl died alone in a burning tower, hated by the demons and feared by the humans and mourned by nobody. He remembered typing that ending in a single lazy afternoon. He did not want to be that writer anymore. He picked up the ring. Back in the main chamber, he offered it to her without ceremony. He said the domain owed her a reward. He said the ring suited her hair. He said simply that he wanted her to have it. Renee looked at him for a long moment. Then, very carefully, she put the ring on her finger. She did not say thank you. She did not smile. But her face was different when she turned away, and her ears, under her short white hair, had gone quietly pink. He noticed. He did not know why he noticed. He filed the small detail away for later. They rode back to the estate before dawn. Neither of them mentioned the ring during the ride. Renee did, however, keep looking down at her hand as if she had never seen it before. Once, when a low branch startled her horse and she almost dropped her reins, she caught herself and stared at the pale moonstone on her finger, as if it had personally insulted her. Nam Wuhyun watched her from the corner of his stolen eye and, for the first time since his arrival in this world, felt something almost like peace. The peace did not last. Patriarch Kree summoned them the next morning. He said the academy year was already beginning. He said Renee and her new shield would leave for Saitan Capital by nightfall. He said casually that his patience would run out the moment they failed to make him proud. Then he sent them out the door. The road to Saitan Capital took 8 days. They shared a plain black carriage with an old driver who did not speak. Nam Wuhyun spent most of the ride reading, sleeping, and pretending to sleep so that he could watch Renee through half-closed eyes. She spent most of the ride staring out the window. Twice, when she thought he was not looking, she lifted her hand and turned the moon ring toward the light. Then she caught herself, put her hand down, and glared at nothing in particular. On the 6th night, at a rest stop inn, she finally asked him. She asked him, in her flat voice, if he understood what the ring meant. He blinked at her. He said he had picked it up in a necromancer's tomb. He said it looked nice on her hand. She was quiet for a long time. Then she stood up from the table without answering and walked out into the courtyard, back straight, ears pink again. He watched her go. He looked down at his soup. He wondered, with a slow chill, whether he had accidentally proposed marriage to a demon princess. He decided not to ask the paper. He was not sure his gold could survive the answer. Saitan Capital rose out of a wide gray plain on the morning of the 8th day. The city was enormous. Its walls were black. Its towers were black. Its bridges arched over dark rivers that steamed in the cold air. A red iron gate the size of a fortress stood open at its western end. A steady stream of demon nobles moved through it in armored carriages, their crests bright against the gray stone. Above them all, on the far side of the city, rose Saitan Academy. It sat on a high stone plateau at the city's heart. Its walls were built into the mountain itself. Its towers were tall and slim. Its crest, a black rose wrapped around a broken sword, hung above every gate. Na Mu-hyun looked up at it and, very quietly, remembered writing every one of those towers. They registered at the front hall. Renee's registration went quickly. A young clerk in a silver robe bowed to her, asked one polite question, wrote her name into the black ledger, and stamped her tag with the Bear Clan crest. The clerk did not so much as look up when the boy behind her stepped forward. Then he looked up. Then he stopped writing. The clerk's eyes traveled from the fox-eyed boy's silver hair to his mixed blood skin to his plain black robe. His mouth tightened. He put down his stamp. He said, in a very correct voice, that Saitan Academy did not normally take half-demons off the street. He said, more quietly, that the ledger was full for the year. Nam Woo-hyun smiled thinly. He did not raise his voice. He did not argue. He simply placed the Bear Clan's letter of sponsorship on the counter, flat and plain, and turned it so that the clerk could see the seal. The clerk went white. He wrote the name in the ledger with a hand that shook. He stamped the tag. He handed it over with a bow so deep his forehead almost touched the wood. Renee, behind Nam Woo-hyun, made a soft sound that might have been a laugh. The entrance exam was scheduled for that afternoon. Applicants gathered in the Academy's central hall, a vast round room with a floor of polished black glass. Nam Woo-hyun counted almost 300 candidates. Half were young nobles in bright silks and jeweled cloaks. The other half were mixed blood, quiet, and dressed plainly. He knew, without checking the paper, that most of those would not survive the year. Renee stood beside him. Around them, the airs of the 7 deadly sins began to filter into the room. He watched them come in with the quiet attention of a man watching his own children walk on stage. A tall boy with wine-dark hair and a lazy smile. That was Baltan, heir of envy, a battle maniac who loved fights the way other boys loved girls. A slender girl in golden silks, hair like sunlight, eyes half-lidded and bored. That was Laurel Fron, heir of lust, a charmer with sharper claws than her voice suggested. A short boy with a hard face and a scar across his knuckles. That was Samuel, sole survivor of the House of Greed, and one of the young men Nam Woo-hyun had cursed, with a childhood too cruel to reprint. And then, last, a young woman in a plain white cloak. Small, quiet, red eyes. Diana, heir of wrath, the future demon lord. He looked at her for barely a heartbeat before he made himself look away. She noticed the look anyway. Her red eyes tracked him across the room without moving her head, patient and slow, the way a hawk watched a rabbit. He felt his skin prickle. Of every child in this room, she was the one he had written to be smartest, and now that meta-knowledge felt like a small blade held against his back. He had to be careful with her. At the far end of the hall, the headmaster stepped out onto a raised black stage. Lucian was not tall. She was not broad. She was a woman of middle years in a plain black coat, her hair pulled back in a simple braid, her hands folded neatly behind her back. Her face was calm, her eyes were the color of tarnished coins. She looked, to a stranger, like nothing more than a strict aunt about to give a lecture. Then she released her aura. The pressure hit the hall like a dropped mountain. Half the candidates were on their knees before they knew they were falling. Cups shattered on side tables. Candles blew out. A boy in the back row simply fainted. The air itself seemed to thicken, as if the room had been dropped a mile deep under the sea. Nam Woo-hyun felt his knees buckle. He felt every bone in his body remember how small a bone was. His stolen lungs would not take a full breath. He almost went down. Then he reached, without thinking, for the trait he had been given 3 nights ago in a locked bedroom. Killing intent. The paper had described it as a wall. He had never used it. He built it now. He pushed back. It was not clean. It was not graceful. It was a boy with a candle trying to hold up the sky. But his candle held, just enough, and the pressure around him bent by a small, useful degree. He drew a slow breath. He straightened his spine. He met the headmaster's tarnished eyes. Beside him, Renee was already standing tall, unmoved. So was Diana. So was Laurel. So was Baltan. So was Samuel, teeth clenched, blood at the corner of his mouth but on his feet. Of the 300 candidates in the hall, fewer than 20 were still standing after the first minute. Lucian raised her aura higher. Around Nam Woo-hyun, more people fell. A noble girl with sapphire pins in her hair collapsed into her own skirts. A large boy in a red cape dropped in silence. The remaining candidates trembled like reeds in a storm. The headmaster's eyes drifted across each of them in turn. She was not being cruel. She was reading them, the way a jeweler reads a stone. When her eyes reached the fox-eyed boy from Leon County, she paused. She looked at him for a full 3 seconds. Her calm face did not change, but her tarnished eyes narrowed by the smallest degree, and Nam Wu-Hian felt his stomach drop. She was, he realized, reading him the way he read his own characters. She was measuring the small hidden things in him, the trait he had built, the eye he carried, the God's mark on his heart. He held her look. He did not have a choice. If he flinched now, she would remember him as prey. And prey did not survive Saitan. After the longest minute of his stolen life, Lucian looked away. She held her aura for another 60 seconds, unchanging, then folded it neatly back into herself, as if it had been a fan. Around the room, the survivors sagged, gasped, or simply stood in silence, sweat pouring down their faces. Nam Wu-Hian was one of them. The headmaster smiled a small, patient smile. She said the first test was over. She said the second test would begin at once. She said, quietly, that those still standing had done well, and those on the floor had done exactly as she expected. She turned and walked from the stage. She left an assistant to explain the rules. The second test was, on paper, simple. The candidates would be divided into small teams of 4. Each team would enter a training chamber and face a magical clone of a legendary human swordsman. The clone would fight with roughly a tenth of the original master's strength. Any team that survived long enough to strike the clone once would pass. Any team that fell before then would be sent home. Nam Wu-Hian's team was pulled at random. He looked at the 3 faces beside him. None of them were the Sin's heirs, none of them were Renee. One was a small, nervous boy with pale hair and a shaking hand on a curved sword. One was a broad, quiet girl with a scarred chin and a heavy axe. The last was a lean, older student with a bored expression and a spear he clearly did not want to use. All 3 of them looked at Nam Wu-Hian with the polite despair of people who had already decided to lose. He felt a small, tired flicker of humor. He was the writer of this world, and he had just been handed the worst possible party in his own story. They walked into the chamber together. The Sword Saint clone waited at the far end of the room. It stood tall and still, in a plain gray coat, its face blank and pale, its blade resting lightly against its shoulder. Even at a tenth of its original strength, it filled the air with a pressure that made the small, pale-haired boy whimper. Nam Wu-Hian drew a slow breath. He said, in a low, even voice, that his 3 teammates were going to survive this fight. He said their only job was to stay behind him, hold their weapons up, and pretend to be a threat. He said, calmly, that he would handle the rest. Then, before they could argue, he stepped forward alone. The Sword Saint clone tilted its pale head. It considered him the way a bored teacher considered a homework page. Then, without warning, it moved. Nam Wu-Hian had written the Sword Saint in one long afternoon 2 years ago. He had described the man as a blade that had forgotten it was a man. He remembered every stroke he had given him, every stance, every cruel little habit. Even at a tenth of that strength, the clone crossed the chamber in a single gray blur. Its blade came down for his skull. He was not where the blade landed. He was standing behind a pillar 6 paces away, the yellow paper still warm against his ribs. His teammates flinched. The clone did not. It turned on its heel and came at him again. This time it did not swing at his head. It swung at where his head would be in a second. A trained cut, meant for a runner. He swapped with the small, pale-haired boy's dropped sheath on the floor. The clone's blade hit stone. It cracked the tile. Nam Wu-Hian was already moving. He did not fight the clone. He read it. Every step it took, he had written its footwork years ago. Every angle of its blade, he had once described in careful lines to make the fight scenes flow. He was reading his own book at speed, and every page told him where the next cut would be. He circled the chamber. He did not strike. He led. He drew the clone toward the center of the room in a slow, patient dance, swapping with candlesticks, with pillar shadows, with dropped weapons his 3 frozen teammates had left on the floor. The clone chased him. The clone almost caught him twice. The clone did not, quite. His 3 teammates stared. The lean older student muttered, in a small, confused voice, that this was not the fight he had signed up for. Nam Wu-Hian reached the center of the chamber. He let the fang of darkness slide from his sleeve into his hand. He whispered a word he had once written into a very short chapter. The room went dark. It was not a candle-out kind of dark. It was a bag over your head kind of dark. His darkness trait, focused through the fang, ate every light in the chamber. The pale glow of the runes on the walls dimmed. The blue lamps flickered and died. His 3 teammates gasped. Even the clone stopped mid-step, its blank face turning slowly, as if it had not expected a candidate to bring the night itself into a testing room. Inside the black, Na Muhyun smiled. He had never fought a sword saint in his life. But he had written a fight, once, in which someone drowned a swordsman in shadow and killed him with 100 small cuts from every angle at once. He had been proud of that chapter. His editor had marked it as too much. He was about to see if it worked in real life. He struck first from the left. His position transfer put him at the clone's flank in a blink. The fang bit through the clone's gray coat and drew a thin line of silver light. The clone spun. He was gone. He was at the clone's other flank. The fang bit again. The clone spun. He was gone. He was behind. Above. Below. On the ceiling, briefly. On the wall. He moved in the dark like a knife with 1,000 hands. Every strike was small. Every strike was survivable. A 10th strength sword saint could shrug off 100 paper cuts. But paper cuts, done in the right places, drained a body. Nam Woo-hyun cut wrists, cut ankles, cut the tendon behind the knee, cut the pale muscle under the sword arm. He did not try to kill, he tried to unmake, one hinge at a time. The clone hunted him in the black. It swung faster than a man could think. Twice, its blade grazed his ribs. Once, it caught the tail of his coat and tore it clean off. He hissed. He kept moving. His mana burned like oil in his chest. His new god-marked pool held. If he had tried this fight 3 days ago, he would already be dead. The clone slowed. Its footing began to slip. Its blade grew heavy. Its blank, pale face was streaked with silver light where his shadow daggers had opened it. He heard, in his own head, the small voice of a writer who had once feared this character. That voice was quiet now. He had written this fight, and he was winning it. He readied the last cut. He whispered the second half of the dark chapter. He built 100 shadow daggers in the black around the clone, each one a splinter of his darkness trait, each one shaped by the fang. They hung in the air like a silent rain. The clone lifted its blade to guard. Then Nam Woo-hyun swapped. Every one of the daggers switched place with a point on the clone's gray body. The rain hit inward from every side at once. The clone did not scream. It only shivered, once, and came apart in a soft gray mist that smelled faintly of ozone and old paper. The chamber went bright again. His 3 teammates were on their knees. The pale-haired boy was crying without knowing it. The scarred girl had not lowered her axe. The lean, older student was staring at Nam Woo-hyun the way one might stare at a live grenade. Nam Woo-hyun tucked the fang back into his sleeve and, in the calmest voice he could manage, told them that he thought they had passed. Somewhere above the chamber, in the black observation room where the instructors watched, someone was very quiet for a long time. The reward chamber opened at dusk. The candidates who had passed the second test were led, in small groups, down a long stair into a vault under the academy. Its walls were lined with heavy stone shelves. Its shelves were lined with weapons. Every kind of weapon the demon realm had ever forged glittered under low silver lamps. A large red rune above the door marked the vault as protected. Every candidate could pick a single item, and only a single item, and only if the vault itself decided to let them. Nam Woo-hyun walked slowly along the shelves. He did not touch anything at first. He looked, hands folded behind his back, at rows of blades and hammers and small hooked axes. Most of them were fine weapons. Some of them were legendary. A few were clearly bait, cursed under bright polish, meant to trap greedy hands. He knew which was which. He had cataloged this vault in a 2-page appendix nobody had ever read. He slid the yellow paper out from his sleeve and, with small, careful writing, asked its owner to guide his hand. The paper answered without demanding a price. It was, he realized, quietly amused. He passed a shining sword the paper called a pretty poison. He passed a beautiful glass bow the paper called a heart-eater. He passed a warhammer the paper called a good weapon for a stupid man. At the far end of the vault, on the highest, dustiest shelf, sat a small black box. The box was plain. Its clasp was tarnished. It looked forgotten. Nam Woo-hyun reached up on his toes and pulled it down. Inside the box was a necklace. It was a thin silver chain set with 7 small jewels. Each jewel was a different color. Each was cut in a different shape. In the very center of the chain hung a small round pendant carved with a mark he did not recognize. The paper on his chest grew warm the moment he touched it. The paper's next line was short. It said the necklace ate what the wearer sacrificed. It said its true price was a god. He almost put it back. Then, without letting himself think, he lifted it from the box and lowered it around his neck. The pendant settled on his sternum, right over the silver eye pride had carved into him. The chain grew warm and quiet against his skin. Nothing else happened. He tucked it under his collar and walked out of the vault. Behind him, on their own shelves, 3 of the vault's most famous weapons remained untouched. He heard, later, that the young man of envy had taken a great red halberd, that the girl of lust had taken a golden mirror, and that Renee had taken nothing at all, because her father had already given her every blade she needed. At the top of the stairs, someone waited for him. Bolton of envy leaned against a pillar, wine-dark hair loose over his shoulder, a lazy smile on his mouth. His new halberd rested against the stone beside him. He did not look at Na Mu-hyun's necklace. He looked at Na Mu-hyun's face, and he smiled the smile of a boy who had already picked a fight in his own head. He said he had watched the second test. He said he had never seen a half-demon put a sword saint clone in a bag before. He said it had been rude, in a way, to steal that fight from the rest of the class. Then he offered a hand, in the polite manner of a young noble, as if to congratulate him. Nam Woo-hyun looked at the hand. The paper against his chest hummed warmly. He took the hand anyway. Bolton's grip closed on his like a vice. It closed harder, harder. Bones creaked. The wine-dark boy's smile did not change. He said, very softly, that he wondered how much a fox-eyed shield could take before it broke. He said softly that he would love to test that in a duel to the death someday. Nam Woo-hyun's mana pool boiled. He did not draw, he did not flinch. He simply lifted his eyes to Bolton's and swapped places with the halberd resting against the pillar. A blink later, the halberd was in his own hand, and Bolton's grip was closed on empty air. The wine-dark boy stumbled forward. His halberd was pressed lightly against his own back. Bolton blinked. Then he laughed. It was a delighted, cracked laugh. The laugh of a boy who had just heard a very good joke told in a language he had almost forgotten. He drew a short blade from his belt. He said, in the pleased voice of a battle maniac, that he would love a full fight right now. A sword rang softly out of its sheath behind them both. Renee stepped between them without hurry. She did not lift her blade. She only rested its edge on the polished floor, where its light caught both boys' eyes at once. She said, in her flat, precise voice, that this hallway was not a dueling ground. She said, more quietly, that if Baltan wanted to fight the Bear Clan's shield, he could send a formal challenge to her house and be handled properly. Her eyes were the cold of a frozen lake. Bolton looked at her for a long moment. Then he laughed again, bowed with mock politeness, and slid his short blade back into its sheath. He said Renee was no fun. He said he would remember the fox-eyed boy. He walked off, whistling, his halberd back in his hand as if nothing had happened. Nam Woo-hyun let out a slow breath. Renee slid her own blade back over her shoulder. She did not look at him. She only said quietly that he should try to make fewer enemies before the classes even began. Then she walked past him without waiting for a reply. He noticed again that her ears were pink. They spent the next morning in the capital. The academy year would begin in 3 days. Until then, the new students were free to wander. Renee walked the black stone streets in silence, hood up, sword hidden under her cloak. Nam Woo-hyun walked beside her, hands in his sleeves, and made an effort not to look at every rooftop like a man expecting arrows. The capital was strange in the way only a place a writer had once described in 3 sentences could be strange. He recognized every square. He did not recognize the smells, the small children playing, the food carts on the corners. His own book had never mentioned street skewers. Yet here they were, sizzling on iron grates, dripping fat into small pans, and Renee, without expression, bought 2. She handed him one without looking at him. She said, flat as ever, that a bodyguard should not starve on the job. He ate the skewer standing up in a busy square. It was very good. He had not written it. He was starting to like this world for reasons he had not put on the page. At the far end of the square stood the statue of the first Demon King. It was massive. It was black stone, 30 feet tall, carved in the shape of a broad man in armored robes, his face hidden under a low hood, one hand resting on the pommel of a great sword. Around its feet, small offerings of coin and bone lay in a shallow bowl. Old demons in dark cloaks bowed to it and moved on. Nam Wuhyun walked toward it out of habit. He had written this statue too. It had been a short paragraph in an early chapter, meant to establish the setting. He stopped at its feet. The pendant under his collar grew warm. Then it grew hot. He looked down. Under his tunic, a small red glow pulsed against his chest, then dimmed. When he pulled his collar aside, one of the 7 small jewels on the chain had turned gray. It sat on the silver chain like a dead eye, its light spent. The other 6 still shone in their colors. He looked up at the statue. The Stone King did not move. Its hooded face gave nothing back. But somewhere very deep inside his own chest, in the place where Pride's silver eye still burned, he felt something turn its head to look at him. Renee stepped up beside him. She glanced at the necklace. Her flat eyes narrowed by a small, worried degree. She did not ask. He did not offer. They stood in silence for a moment. Then she turned him gently away from the statue by the elbow, and they walked out of the square together, and neither of them spoke about it for the rest of the day. He tucked the necklace under 2 layers of shirt after that. Classes began 3 days later. Class A of Saitan Academy was small on purpose. Only the top 20 candidates in the entrance exam were allowed into it, and only 20 passed. Nam Wuhyun was one. Renee was one. So were the Sin's heirs, every last one of them, including Diana, who sat in the back row without a word and watched the door. The classroom itself was a wide, tall chamber with a black stone floor. Its walls were carved with the crests of the 7 great clans. Its ceiling was painted with the Great War, in dark colors that had faded and dried over years. Their homeroom instructor walked in on the stroke of the hour. She was a young woman in a long coat. She was thin. She was pretty in a way that made Nam Wuhyun's writer brain immediately suspicious. She smiled at them, a slow, pleased smile, and introduced herself as Instructor Idea. She said she taught a course called The Legion of Calamity. She said cheerfully that most of the course was designed to teach them how to lead armies against humans. She said more cheerfully that the failure rate was steep. Then she got to the reason for that morning's class. Every year, she said, Class A elected a class representative. The representative would speak for the class in every meeting. The representative would lead the class in every field exercise. The representative would be blamed personally when the class failed. She said, with her slow, pleased smile, that she had already chosen one. She said the name. Nam Wuhyun blinked. The name was his. Somewhere to his left, Laurel Fran made a small, sharp sound like a kettle about to boil. Laurel rose from her desk in a rustle of golden silk. Her sunlight-colored hair had been braided down her back that morning, and her eyes, half-lidded and lazy, were suddenly wide and hot. She said, in a voice sweeter than any voice he had heard from her yet, that there must have been some mistake. She said sweetly that she was the heir of lust. She said sweetly that she was the top-ranked noble child in the room by every measure. She said sweetly that the position clearly belonged to her. Instructor Idea smiled at her, unmoved. She said the choice was made. She said the choice was not up for discussion. Then she added, with a small tilt of her head, that if Laurel wanted the position, she was welcome to demonstrate her fitness by passing the same test the new representative had already passed in her head. Laurel blinked at that. She sat down slowly. Her sweet smile had gone very small. Her lazy eyes tracked Nam Wuhyun across the room, and he felt, in that moment, that he had just made a second enemy in a week that had run out of room for enemies. Idea turned to him. She said, calmly, that she had picked him because a class representative needed to think fast under real pressure, and that she had watched him lead 3 frightened teammates against a Sword Saint clone in a chamber full of shadow. She said, calmly, that a boy who could do that could handle Class A. Then she gave him his first test as representative on the spot. She said the test was a small one. It was a battlefield puzzle. She waved one hand, and above the classroom floor, a hovering illusion of a small field of war appeared. In the illusion, a demon vanguard was pinned in a narrow valley by a human legion. The valley had one entrance. The valley had one exit. The human legion had blocked both. The demon vanguard had 30 seconds of air left before the mage in the human column collapsed the ceiling on their heads. Idea said, in her sweet, steady voice, that most representatives took an hour to solve this puzzle. She said sweetly that Nam Wuhyun had 30 seconds. He looked at the illusion for the length of a single breath. He walked forward. He pointed to a small black dot in the human column, the mage himself, standing behind 2 long shield lines. He pointed to a small brass helmet, lying discarded in the valley below, in the demon vanguard's rear. He said calmly that a spatial mage in the demon vanguard would simply swap the mage and the helmet. He said the human column would collapse the valley on their own commander, and the demon vanguard would walk out of the smoke without a scratch. The illusion above the class rippled and, when Idea flicked her fingers, played out exactly as he had described. The illusion mage vanished. A small brass helmet appeared in his place. The illusion human column, following its orders, brought down the illusion mountain onto its own head. The class was very quiet. Renee's cold face did not change. Balton's grin did. Laurel's small sweet smile did not survive contact with the illusion. Diana, in the back row, tilted her small pale face to one side, and her red eyes rested on Nam Wu Hyun for a long, patient moment. He felt, again, that small blade against his back. Instructor Idea clapped her hands once. She said, cheerfully, that he was confirmed as class representative. She said cheerfully that she looked forward to what he would do next. Then she turned to the rest of the class, still smiling, and said that they would all begin their first Legion of Calamity assignment together within the hour. She walked to her desk and picked up her book. Nam Wu Hyun sat down slowly. His hands were shaking a little. His mana pool was calm. Under his tunic, the silver eye of pride was warm, and the small necklace with 6 colored jewels and 1 gray one was warmer still. Behind him, in the last row, he felt Diana's red eyes never leave his back. Their magic instructor was very different. They met him 2 hours later, in a round tower at the eastern edge of the academy. His name was Robolt. He was very old. He was very thin. He wore small round spectacles and a coat that had once been white, and was now a colorful spectrum of ash and reagent stains. His office smelled of copper and old paper. He greeted them without looking up from a book. He said absently that he would test each of their elemental affinities. He said absently that this test would decide what they studied for the rest of the year. He said, still absently, that they should try not to break his floor. He tested them one by one. Each student stepped up to a small silver bowl set in the middle of the floor. Each student dropped a single drop of blood into the bowl. Each drop of blood flared up in a color: green for wood, blue for water, red for fire, yellow for lightning, brown for earth, silver for wind, black for darkness, white for holy. Balton's blood burned yellow. Robolt nodded and marked lightning. Laurel's blood burned pink. Robolt paused, then nodded, and marked charm, a rare sub-branch of lust magic. Samuel's blood burned brown. Robolt nodded and marked earth. Renee's blood burned a plain steel gray. Robolt nodded and marked what he called metal, an old and heavy affinity that suited a swordswoman built of iron. Diana's blood burned a red so dark it was almost black. Robolt paused a long time on that one. He said quietly, that wrath had many faces. He marked her simply as her clan's element. Then Nam Wu Hyun stepped up. He was not sure what would happen. The paper on his chest gave him no warning. He pricked his finger over the silver bowl. His blood dropped in. For a moment the drop just sat there, dark red. Then it split. Half of it burned black, the color of darkness. The other half did not burn at all, exactly. It glowed. It shone with a pale, patient gray light that had no name in the rune chart on Robolt's wall. It flickered like fog. It bent the light around it. Robolt lowered his spectacles. He looked at the drop for a long, quiet minute. He said softly that he had not seen that color in 50 years. He said softly that it was called chaos. He asked, in the calm voice of a teacher who had suddenly become very interested, if Nam Wu Hyun would come to his lab, alone, after class. Nam Wu Hyun bowed politely. He said calmly that he would be honored. Under his tunic, the small necklace with its 1 gray jewel and 6 colored jewels warmed against his chest, and somewhere in a chamber far above, in a wide window that looked out over the whole academy, the headmaster Lucian set down her tea and, without a word, watched the eastern tower for a long time. Robolt's lab was hidden 3 floors under the eastern tower. Nam Wu Hyun followed the old man down a narrow stone stair after the last class of the day. The walls grew warmer as they descended. The air began to smell of copper and pressed herbs. Small cages hung from the ceiling on iron chains, each one holding a strange soft glow that was not quite fire and not quite light. At the bottom, Robolt pushed open a heavy black door. The room beyond was round and low, filled with tables. On every table stood a jar. In every jar floated something that had been alive at some point in its history. Nam Woo-hyun tried not to look at any of them too long. He was, after all, still the writer here, and he did not enjoy remembering he had once put half of these creatures on the page for atmosphere. Robolt shooed a small pale cat off a stool and offered the stool to his student. He said, without ceremony, that chaos was not a taught magic. He said chaos was a magic that let itself be found. He said, with a small dry smile, that most bodies that carried it went insane, and that most bodies that did not go insane died in strange ways within a year. Then he offered Nam Woo-hyun a cup of dark tea and asked, politely, if he had felt anything unusual since the affinity test. Nam Woo-hyun sipped the tea, which tasted faintly of ash, and thought about the answer. He said carefully that his shadow sometimes did not move when he did. Robolt's small eyes lit up behind his round spectacles. He said that was a good sign. He said cheerfully that his shadow behaving oddly meant the chaos in him was already looking for a shape. He said more cheerfully that most bodies with chaos went insane precisely because the magic never found a shape and simply ate its host from the inside instead. He said kindly that he could help find a shape for it. They worked for 2 hours. Robolt lit a small silver rune on the floor. He asked Nam Woo-hyun to sit inside it. He asked him to close his eyes. He asked him to picture something simple, a small thing he wanted to happen, and to let his chaos guess at the rest. Nam Woo-hyun closed his eyes. He pictured himself, in his fox-eyed body, being small, not shrunken, not hidden behind a wall, simply small, beneath notice, the kind of small that a bored guard's eye slid over on a bored night, the kind of small a mother did not see her own child do when the child had done something wrong and did not want to be scolded. He pictured being present without being present. The chaos in his blood picked up the picture and turned it in its own hands. The rune under him hummed. His shadow flickered. His outline blurred. For a single second, the writer in the stolen body was not there at all, and Robolt, staring straight at him, could not find him with his eyes. Then Nam Woo-hyun sneezed. The whole thing collapsed. He came back into focus, coughing, with a headache that felt like a hammer had been dragged across the roof of his skull. His hearing was gone in one ear. His left hand had lost feeling from the wrist down. He stared at his own numb fingers with a slow, cold understanding. Robolt clapped, delighted. He said the shape had been found. He said the shape was called absolute invisibility. He said, gently, that the price for a full use would be a random one of the user's senses for a random length of time. He said kindly that Nam Woo-hyun should try not to use it near the top of a stair, since losing his sense of balance mid-step would be embarrassing. The old man patted his shoulder. He said sincerely that it was a good day's work. Nam Woo-hyun sat in the rune for a long moment after the lesson. He rubbed at his ear until his hearing came back. He flexed his numb fingers until they stopped being numb. He thought, quietly, that he had just added the strongest tool of his life to his belt, and that its price was going to kill him one day if he was not careful. He filed that thought under later. Robolt, at his desk on the other side of the lab, was already scribbling notes on a piece of paper, muttering to himself about ancient bloodlines. He did not look up when his student stood to leave. He only said, absently, that he expected Nam Woo-hyun to come back tomorrow after class. He said, without turning around, that a boy with chaos in his blood was going to need a friend in this academy, and that Robolt was as close to a friend as any old man in this tower was likely to give. Nam Woo-hyun smiled a small, tired smile. He said, quietly, that he would come back. He climbed the stair. Somewhere far above, night had already fallen over the black-stoned academy, and the pale windows of Class A's dorm wing glowed against the mountain like a row of quiet eyes. He found Luna in the courtyard behind the dorm. She was sitting on a low wall by herself. She was small. She was pale. Her hair was the light brown of an old field, and her eyes were the soft green of new leaves. She wore the plain robe of a first-year student and no crest at all. She was crying without making a sound. Nam Woo-hyun sat down on the wall a polite distance from her. He did not speak at first. He looked up at the sliver of pale moon over the academy roof and let the silence settle. He remembered writing Luna in a rushed afternoon 2 summers ago. He had given her a soft voice and a soft heart and had marked her, in his outline, as a background character who died off-screen in the second act. He had not given her a family name because he had not thought she needed one. The paper on his chest was warm. After a long moment, Luna wiped her eyes with the corner of her sleeve. She looked at him. Her small green eyes went a little wider when she recognized him. She said, in a very quiet voice, that she was sorry to be seen like this. She said, quieter still, that she had failed her first healing class that afternoon, and that the instructor had told her mixed bloods without a talent for healing did not last a year at Saitan. Nam Wu Hian looked at her. He thought of the 2-line paragraph he had written for her death, once. He said, quietly, that the healing instructor was wrong. He said calmly that he needed a healer in his midterm party, and that he would like her to join it. He said Luna had been placed in Class B rather than Class A, and that this was normally a small tragedy, but that Class A students were allowed to recruit their party members from any class in the academy. He said he was choosing her because he thought she had the hands for the work, even if she did not yet believe it. Luna stared at him. She asked, in a small, disbelieving voice, why he would want a healer who had failed her first class. Nam Wu Hian gave her a small, honest smile. He said quietly that he had seen her bandage a sparrow's wing at the front gate on the day of the entrance exam. He said quietly that a girl who stopped to bandage a wounded bird on the day of the hardest test of her life was exactly the kind of healer he wanted at his back. Luna cried again after that, but differently. She said yes. The next afternoon, Instructor Idea walked into the classroom with a scroll of black paper in her hand. She said, cheerfully, that Class A was going on a field trip. She said the field trip would be to a place called the Oregon Prison Camp. She said Oregon was a small mining town on the border of the demon realm, held by demon forces, and that its lowest level was used to house captured human soldiers taken in border raids. She said cheerfully that Class A would be leaving in the morning, and that they should pack lightly. She said cheerfully that they would be conducting an exercise on prisoner handling. Renee, beside Nam Wu Hian, did not move. Her cold face gave nothing back. Laurel, in her golden silks, filed her nails and looked bored. Balton grinned like a boy invited to a very good party. Luna, in the visitor's chair Idea had set up at the back of the room that morning, went the color of old paper. Nam Wu Hian watched Luna out of the corner of his eye and felt something in his chest set itself against what was coming. He had written Oregon. He had written it in a rushed chapter that ran for 8 pages. He had given the prison a sharp, small cruelty, the kind of cruelty a writer sprinkled onto a page to establish that a world was hard. He had not, until now, sat next to a small brown-haired girl who had failed her first healing class and thought about what those pages would actually taste like when the ink came alive. He raised his hand. He asked calmly if the exercise was likely to involve killing. Instructor Idea gave him a slow, pleased smile. She said, cheerfully, that a class representative asking that question at the front of the class was exactly why she had chosen him. She said, cheerfully, that the exercise would involve exactly as much killing as each student's judgment allowed. She said, in a smaller voice, that it would also involve a demonstration. She did not explain what the demonstration was. She did not need to. They rode out at dawn. Oregon lay 2 days east of the capital, in a wide, dry valley the demons had taken from the humans 40 years ago. Its walls were low, its towers were plain, its air smelled faintly of iron and the sweeter, worse smell of the mines below. The demon garrison stationed there was small. The prisoner block was large. Instructor Idea led them through the front gate without ceremony. The prisoners were kept in a long, low hall lit by pale blue lamps. There were rows of iron cages set into the floor. The prisoners inside them were thin and quiet. Most of them were young. Most of them had the plain, tired faces of soldiers who had been left too long in one place. A few of them looked up when Class A walked in. Most of them did not. Instructor Idea stopped in the middle of the hall. She said, in her cheerful voice, that today's lesson was on execution. She said, cheerfully, that any commander who could not perform an execution would fail as a commander. She said, cheerfully, that any student who could not perform an execution would fail as a student. She said the goal was not cruelty. She said the goal was clarity. She said a mixed blood in Class A who could not kill a captured human soldier would be a liability the class could not carry. She said each student would take 1 prisoner. She said the choice of method was up to them. She said cheerfully that if any student could not perform the exercise, they would be marked as unable to serve at the front, and their names would be forwarded to the academy for reassignment. Reassignment, she added, in a very quiet voice, was not a good outcome for a mixed blood in this school. Luna, at the back of the class, made a small sound like a wounded animal. Then Instructor Idea called the class forward and offered her demonstration. She reached into a small satchel at her belt. She drew out a black glass ball, no bigger than a plum. The ball was warm. The ball was smooth. The ball was quietly alive with a soft red light at its core. She walked to the nearest cage and opened its door. The prisoner inside, a thin man with a broken nose, tried to shrink back and could not, because his chains would not let him. She sat down beside him with the small ball in her hand. She said, in the same cheerful voice, that this was a magic ball of misery, of the kind commanders used to break enemy officers before battle. She said, in the same cheerful voice, that it fed on the mana in a body and turned that mana into a specific, private suffering. She placed the ball against the prisoner's mouth. She waited. His mouth opened, not by his choice. He tried to close it. He could not. The ball rolled inside, slowly and neatly, as if it had been polished for exactly this purpose. He swallowed. He did not want to. He did anyway. For a long, terrible second, nothing happened. Then the man's head began to swell. It swelled slowly at first, the way rising bread swelled. His eyes bulged. His mouth stretched. His skull creaked, a small, wet sound in the pale blue light of the hall. He made a noise. It was not a scream. He no longer had the shape for a scream. He made a small, gurgling, private sound that Na Mu-hyun would remember for the rest of his stolen life. Then his head burst. It burst wetly. It burst in every direction at once. A soft red mist of blood and thinner things sprayed across the cage bars, across the pale blue floor, across the front of Instructor Idea's long coat. She did not flinch. She did not step back. She only sighed, a small, patient sigh, and wiped her cheek with the back of her hand. She said, cheerfully, that the demonstration was over. She said cheerfully that the students would now perform their own. Class A moved forward. Some of them moved eagerly. Balton, in particular, grinned as he walked toward a chosen cage. Some of them moved reluctantly. Laurel Fraun, of all people, did not smile at all as she walked toward hers. Diana walked toward the far end of the hall without a word, chose a cage at random, and finished her prisoner with a single flick of her small hand before anyone else had even reached theirs. Her red eyes did not blink. Renee walked past 4 cages. She stopped at a young human soldier who could not have been older than 18. She looked down at him, she looked up at the ceiling, then, with a quiet, efficient movement, she drew her sword and cut the top of his skull off in a single stroke. He died before he understood he had been chosen. She wiped her blade on his sleeve. She walked back to the wall. Her cold face was tighter than usual. Na Mu-hyun walked toward his own chosen cage. He did not look at Luna. He could not. He could feel her, on the edge of his awareness, frozen in place at the back of the group, hands clenched in the folds of her plain robe. He heard, very faintly, the wet, ragged sound of her breathing. He reached his prisoner. The man in the cage was old. He was tired. He had a plain, hard face and eyes that had already stopped hoping. He looked up at Na Mu-hyun with a small, dull calm. He said, in a voice worn down to gravel, that he was ready. Na Mu-hyun looked at him. He drew his small, stolen dagger. He killed the man cleanly, in one strike, at the base of the throat. The old prisoner slumped forward. He did not thrash. He did not fight. He did not, at the end, make Na Mu-hyun work for it. Na Mu-hyun closed his eyes for one long beat, then 2, then walked back to the wall with his dagger in his hand. Then he turned and looked, because he had to, at Luna. Luna had not moved. She stood at the back of the group with both hands over her mouth. Her small green eyes were wide and wet. In front of her, in the cage she had drifted toward without meaning to, a very young human boy with a cracked lip stared up at her without understanding. He could not have been older than 15. Instructor Idea walked toward Luna without hurry. Her voice was still cheerful, in that small, distant way that had gone very cold at the edges. She said, quietly, that a healer from Class B who could not complete this exercise would be reassigned. She said quietly, that reassignment in this case would not be a small matter. She said quietly, that Luna had 1 more minute. Luna's whole small body began to shake. Na Mu-hyun pushed off the wall before he had made the decision to move. He crossed the pale blue floor in 3 quick steps. He reached Luna. He did not touch her at first. He simply stood beside her. He said, in a very low voice she could hear and Idea could not, that she was going to lift her hands and that he was going to help her. Luna looked at him. Her lips shaped a small, wet, silent word. It might have been please, It might have been sorry. He did not ask. He gently drew her small dagger out of the sheath at her belt. He put its hilt in her hand. He closed her small fingers around it. He wrapped his own long, cold fingers around hers, quietly, on top. He guided her hand up and toward the young human boy in the cage. He said, in the same low voice, that she was not doing this. He said quietly that he was doing this. He said quieter still that she should close her eyes. She closed her eyes. He guided the small dagger forward. It was not a clean kill. He was not standing straight enough. His angle was slightly off, but it was a killing stroke, and it was over quickly. The young human boy slid down against the bars without a sound. Luna's small hand shook inside Nam Woo-hyun's. He held it steady until the shaking stopped. Then he lifted the dagger away, cleaned it on his own sleeve, and slid it back into her belt as if she had done all of this by herself. Instructor Idea watched from 10 feet away. Her cheerful face did not change, but her eyes went, for a moment, from him to Luna, and back. She made a small, considering sound in her throat. She said, cheerfully, that the exercise was complete. She said, cheerfully, that Class A was dismissed for the evening. She turned and walked out of the hall. Luna's small hand stayed in Nam Woo-hyun's for a long moment after she left. Then, without looking at him, Luna quietly pulled her hand back, wiped her eyes on her sleeve, and walked, on legs that did not want to hold her, out of the prison block into the cold air of Oregon. The silver eye of pride was warm. The chaos in his blood was very still. He walked out of the hall alone, and the paper against his chest hummed, softly, in something that might, in a kinder world, have been called sympathy. That night, he did not sleep. Oregon's prisoner block sat on top of an old, half-forgotten mine. Nam Woo-hyun had known that when he wrote the town in his book. He had, in a small, careless line, described the mine as running down under the prison in a long spiral, and had mentioned, in one short paragraph nobody had ever remarked on, that a very old skeleton lay at its lowest chamber. He had not, when he wrote it, known what that skeleton was. The paper on his chest knew. He slipped out of the visitors' quarters after midnight. He drew his chaos-shaped absolute invisibility around him like a cloak. He walked past 2 demon guards who did not see him. He walked down through the mine, along a spiral stair damp with old water, past small black slimes that hissed at the smell of him and were killed cleanly by the fang. He walked deeper than any young student had walked in years. At the bottom of the spiral was a small round chamber. At the center of the chamber lay a skeleton in a black robe. Its bones were long. Its skull was tilted slightly to one side, as if listening. In its rib cage, in the space where a living heart would have been, a small, dry, decayed thing sat wrapped in cloth. Nam Woo-hyun knelt in front of the skeleton. He said quietly, in a voice the paper on his chest translated into an older tongue, that he was of the same blood, and that he had come to receive what had been kept for him. The skeleton's jaw moved. It said, in a voice that was not sound but pressure inside his skull, that he was late. It said, in that same silent voice, that chaos was a hungry thing, and that a child of its bloodline who did not learn to hold it would be eaten by it. It said, patient and dry, that the small decayed thing in its ribs was called an ancestor's heart, and that it carried a gift from a life much longer than his own. It said kindly that a boy who had held a small, pale-eyed girl's hand steady over a prisoner's throat that afternoon was, in the ancestor's opinion, the right kind of grandson to be handed the thing. It said quietly that he should take it. He took it. The decayed heart was small and light in his hand. The moment his fingers closed on it, it dried further, and then simply came apart into a thin, silvery dust that slid up his sleeve into his skin. Somewhere inside his chest, a new door opened. He tried, gently, to lift a small stone from the floor without touching it. The stone rose. He tried, gently, to spin it in the air. It spun. He almost laughed. Telekinesis, the paper on his chest whispered, was the ancestors' parting gift. Small, at first. Range short, weight limited. Enough to lift a dagger. Enough to guide a falling body away from a killing blow. Enough, in the right hands, to matter. The skeleton did not speak again. Nam Wu Hyun bowed to it, once, in the human manner. Then he stood, drew absolute invisibility back around himself, and climbed the spiral stair to the surface, where a pale gray dawn was just beginning to break over Oregon, and where, in the visitors' dormitory, a small brown-haired girl with red-rimmed eyes was quietly refusing to eat her breakfast. Class A returned to Saitan Academy 2 days later. On the first evening back, in the shadow of the mountain, in a quiet corner of the dormitory garden, Nam Woo Hyun sat down beside a young half-demon boy who was pretending very hard to read a book. The boy was named Kyle. He was thin. He was polite. He had the plain black hair of a low noble and the small, patient face of a young man who had spent his life apologizing for taking up space. He looked up as Nam Woo Hyun sat down. He smiled, a small, careful smile. He asked, politely, if the class representative needed anything. Nam Woo Hyun looked at him for a long moment. He said gently that he wanted to see Kyle's shoulder. Kyle's small smile flickered. He said, in a careful voice, that his shoulder was fine. Nam Woo Hyun reached out, slowly, and turned back the collar of Kyle's robe. On the pale skin of the boy's shoulder, small and neat and half-hidden under his collarbone, was a black tattoo shaped like a spider. Its 8 eyes were closed. Its legs were folded. It was the mark of a human spy handled by the Imperial Academy's Intelligence Corps. Nam Woo Hyun had written it into his book on a rainy afternoon 2 years ago, in a paragraph he was, quietly, ashamed of. Kyle went very still. Nam Woo Hyun let the collar drop. He sat back on the bench. He said quietly that he was not going to report him. He said quietly that he wanted to talk about Kyle's sister. Kyle's small face went white. The paper against Nam Woo Hyun's chest was warm again. Kyle's sister was named Ray. She was 12. She lived in a small human village near the border. She was, Nam Woo Hyun knew, sick with a slow, wasting illness the humans could not cure. The Imperial Academy had promised Kyle her medicine in exchange for information from the Demon Academy. He had not been able to say no. Nam Woo Hyun told him, quietly, that he knew all of this. He told him, quietly, that the Imperial Academy had been lying about the medicine. He told him, quietly, that the humans had already used the medicine budget for 2 other spies whose sisters were also sick and were also not getting better. He told him that Kyle's information had been paid for with promises the humans never intended to keep. Kyle stared at him. Nam Woo Hyun reached into his sleeve and drew out a small black scroll. He said quietly that he had a better offer. He said quietly that he would put Kyle under a demon god contract, a binding oath signed on the black scroll. He said quietly that the oath would require Kyle to keep feeding the humans information, but that from now on, the information would be false and would come from Nam Woo Hyun. He said quietly that in return, he would personally send healers and medicine to Kyle's sister, and that he would use the paper on his chest to see that she recovered. He said quietly that Kyle could refuse. He said more quietly that if Kyle refused, Nam Woo Hyun would not report him. But he said quietly that eventually somebody else in the Demon Academy would find that small closed-eyed spider on Kyle's shoulder, and that when they did, Kyle would die without saving his sister. Kyle sat on the bench for a long time. Somewhere across the garden, a small bell rang for evening prayer. A soft wind moved through the black stone courtyard. In its quiet, Kyle bowed his head over the small scroll in Nam Woo Hyun's hand and, without saying a word, held out his own thin hand for the pen. He signed. The paper on Nam Woo Hyun's chest warmed. The black scroll flared, once, and the closed-eyed spider on Kyle's shoulder opened its eyes for a heartbeat, then closed them again, as if it had turned over in its sleep to face a new master. Kyle looked up. He said, in a very quiet voice, that he was sorry. Nam Woo Hyun looked at the small, thin, apologetic boy for a long time. He said, in a voice that was almost gentle, that Kyle should not be sorry. He said, more gently still, that a big brother who sold his soul for a sick little sister was not the sort of villain Nam Woo Hyun blamed. He said quietly that from tonight forward, Kyle would work for him, and that the two of them would rewrite the small, cruel paragraph Nam Woo Hyun had once put on a page for atmosphere, He tucked the black scroll back into his sleeve. He stood. He looked up, briefly, at the tall, dark window at the very top of Saitan Academy's central tower. Behind it, in a quiet study, Headmaster Lucian was already looking down at the garden with her tarnished coin eyes, tea in her hand, expression unreadable. Under Nam Wuhian's tunic, the small necklace with its 6 colored jewels and 1 gray jewel hummed against his skin, quiet as a held breath, and the writer in the stolen body allowed himself, for one moment, to smile. The midterm exam was still 6 weeks away,